What happens when power takes a dark turn? The British Empire, known for its global influence, also carried a terrifying legacy of punishment. Prisoners faced unimaginable suffering, from cruel tortures to brutal executions. In this video, we're revealing the shocking reality of how rebellion was met with unimaginable cruelty. Let's uncover the most horrific punishment methods used under British rule, from the infamous drawing and quartering to the terrifying boiling in oil. These methods are more than history. This is a story of fear, cruelty, and the most brutal histories you have ever imagined. Drawing and quartering. The mere mention of drawing and quartering sent a wave of fear across Britain. Reserved only for those guilty of high treason, this horrific execution method marked the height of cruelty in medieval and early modern Britain. The process began with the victim being hanged until almost dead, then cut down while still conscious. They would be disemboweled, fully aware, before being beheaded. Finally, the body was divided into 4 parts and displayed publicly as a gruesome warning. One of the most infamous executions was that of William Wallace in 1305. His dismembered body was displayed across Scotland and England to deter rebellion. Guy Fawkes narrowly avoided this fate, breaking his neck after jumping from the scaffold before the execution could begin. In the 17th century, many Catholic priests, including Oliver Plunkett, met their end this way, with Plunkett's preserved head still on display at St. Peter's Church in Drogheda. The last recorded drawing and quartering took place in 1782, when David Tyree was executed for treason in Portsmouth. This brutal punishment was abolished in 1870, though it marked just one chapter in the long history of cruelty. Branding of criminals. Branding criminals with hot irons was a savage punishment in the British Empire, leaving both physical and social scars. A red-hot iron pressed onto the skin marked the condemned for life. The process involved heating a metal tool until it glowed and then searing it onto visible areas like the face or hands. Each brand had its own meaning. T for thieves, F for fugitives, M for murderers, R for rioters, and V for vagrants. The pain was unbearable, burning the skin and nerves, causing many victims to faint or thrash violently. Beyond the physical torment, the psychological damage was just as severe. Branded criminals became living symbols of their crimes, rejected by society and isolated from family. They often struggled to find work and were forced into the fringes of society. Branding served to identify repeat offenders, humiliate them, and deter others. However, infections from the wounds often led to fevers or even death. Survivors carried not just scars, but emotional wounds that lasted a lifetime. For these individuals, the brand was not just a mark, it was a life sentence. Execution by hanging. What happens when death becomes a public spectacle? The gruesome history of public hangings is shocking. In the British Empire, hangings became the chosen method of execution, a symbol of imperial justice from London to its distant colonies. These executions weren't just punishments, they were events, drawing massive crowds. At Tyburn Tree in London, people from all walks of life gathered for what they called the hanging match. Vendors made a profit, selling snacks, trinkets, and even programs about the condemned criminals' lives. The mechanics of hanging were cruelly precise, with the drop carefully calculated to determine the prisoner's fate. But this system wasn't always flawless. In the 1800s, many hangings went terribly wrong. William Calcraft, infamous for his brutal methods, executed over 450 people, often using short drops that left victims suffering for minutes. One execution lasted a painful 3 minutes before death came. Being an executioner was a job filled with dark prestige. Some hangmen, like James Barry, noted the strange intimacy with condemned prisoners, who often shook their executioner's hand. This role left deep psychological scars, leading to nightmares, alcoholism, and moral conflicts. Many hangmen struggled to reconcile their work with the idea of justice. 3 rats. The fear of rats is widely known, but during the British Empire, this fear was twisted into one of the most brutal forms of torture. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a horrifying technique preyed on the deep human fear of being eaten alive by rats. The execution was chillingly cruel. Guards would trap starving rats in a metal container, placing it against the victim's bare chest or abdomen. As the container was heated, the rats, desperate to escape, would burrow into the victim's flesh. The pain started long before the rats reached the body. Their claws scraped the skin, adding to the agony. The mental torment was equally devastating. Prisoners could hear the rats' frantic movements and feel them wriggling, heightening their terror as the heat built up. The rats would eventually gnaw their way through, causing an excruciating, slow death. Used as both punishment and a tool for interrogation, this form of torture was particularly common in the British colonies, where it was used to intimidate and control. The mere threat of it was often enough to break even the bravest souls. Boiling in oil. One of the most terrifying punishments in British history was death by boiling in oil, a method reserved for the worst criminals to show the extreme cruelty humans can inflict. Picture a huge pot of oil, heated until it's bubbling and smoking, with a crowd watching in horror. The condemned person, often stripped naked, would be lowered into the scalding oil. As their skin burned and peeled away, their screams filled the air. The aim of this gruesome execution was to scare others from committing serious crimes. Death could take anywhere from 15 minutes to several hours, depending on the oil's heat and the executioner's skill. The victim's skin would blister and their organs would cook, with many remaining conscious of their agony until the end. This horrifying punishment was typically used for serious crimes like treason, poisoning, piracy, and heresy. One famous case in 1531 involved Richard Roos, a cook accused of poisoning porridge. King Henry VII ordered his execution by boiling as a public warning against poisoning. Though boiling oil was used mainly in Britain, other regions like East Asia and Europe had similar punishments using water or lead. The practice ended in 1547, but many brutal executions persisted for years. Journey to penal colonies. Exiled thousands of miles from home, convicts endured unimaginable horrors, where death sometimes seemed like a release. The British Empire's penal colonies stand as a chilling reminder of one of history's harshest punishment systems. Between 1788 and 1868, Britain sent around 16,200 convicts to Australia, turning it into a vast prison for those deemed unfit for society. The journey itself was torture. Convict ships known as floating hells packed hundreds of prisoners into dark, disease-ridden holds. Illness spread quickly. Dysentery, typhus, and scurvy claimed many lives. Some ships lost up to 9% of their passengers before even reaching their destination. The First Fleet of 1788 vividly illustrated this cruelty. 11 ships carried 759 convicts on an 8-month journey to establish New South Wales, where they were chained in cramped spaces below deck, fed rotten food, and abused by guards. Life in the colonies was equally brutal. Convicts toiled in harsh labor, from quarrying stone to building structures under the relentless sun. Minor offenses led to flogging, while major ones meant execution. Norfolk Island was notorious for its cruelty, where prisoners begged for death over their suffering. The bloody spectacle of flogging. How did the British Empire use the lash to control crews and crush rebellion? The cat-o'-nine-tails became notorious for its cruelty and brutality. Flogging was one of the Empire's most vicious punishments, reducing human flesh to strips of raw skin and exposed muscle. The cat-o'-nine-tails earned its fearsome reputation due to its design: 9 leather thongs with knots attached to a wooden handle. Each strike intensified the pain, with the knots cutting into the victim's back, causing deep wounds that often became infected due to the unsanitary conditions of ships and prisons. Military leaders claimed this was necessary to maintain discipline. A typical flogging involved 39 lashes for minor offenses, 100 for more serious ones, and even more for desertion or mutiny. The flogging ritual was designed to maximize physical pain and psychological terror. Victims were stripped and tied to a frame, with a ship's surgeon deciding whether the person could endure more strikes. Many did not survive. The entire crew had to witness these punishments. The sight and sound of such cruelty acted as a harsh reminder of the consequences of disobedience, leaving permanent scars, both physical and mental, on the survivors. Strappado. The British Empire's brutal arsenal of torture included the bone-crushing technique known as strappado, a punishment designed to turn human suffering into a tool for domination. In this horrific method, victims had their hands tied behind their backs with thick ropes, then hoisted into the air by a pulley, their bodies hanging unnaturally. The pressure on their shoulder joints often caused immediate dislocations, leading to agonizing pain. Strappado had even more cruel variations. Some victims endured the squared strappado, where weights were tied to their feet, adding to the strain. Others faced jerking strappado, where they were dropped suddenly, only to be stopped abruptly mid-fall, causing violent trauma. The British used this torture to force confessions from suspected criminals and dissidents. The combination of unbearable pain and psychological torment often broke even the strongest spirits. Victims would confess to crimes they didn't commit just to escape the pain. This method of control didn't just leave physical scars, it shattered minds, leaving no visible evidence of the terror endured. The fear of what came next was often just as powerful as the pain itself. What do you think drove people to create such extreme forms of punishment? Let us know in the comments. Imprisonment. In hulks. Imprisonment on a prison hulk wasn't just a punishment, it was a slow death disguised as justice. Imagine an old warship, stripped of its glory and turned into a floating nightmare. These prison hulks were one of the British Empire's most feared methods of punishment in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. After Britain lost its American colonies in 1776, they needed a new place to send convicts. With overcrowded prisons, they used these decommissioned ships as floating jails, a solution that lasted almost 100 years. Life on these ships was brutal. Prisoners were shackled together and forced into dark, damp holds where fresh air was scarce. Disease spread rapidly. Typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis, and dysentery took hold in the filthy conditions. The Thames River hosted many of these floating prisons, with infamous hulks like the HMS Warrior and HMS Bellerophon symbolizing despair. The crimes varied, but many prisoners were awaiting transportation to Australian penal colonies. The mortality rate was high. Around 1 in 4 prisoners died within the first year. Disease, malnutrition, and harsh treatment from guards claimed most lives. Prison reformer John Howard even called the hulks worse than any other form of imprisonment in Britain. Pillar and stocks. Picture yourself in a bustling town square during the British Empire, where a harsh wooden device stands as a chilling reminder of public punishment. The pillory, a medieval invention used until the 19th century, trapped its victims by locking their heads and hands between 2 wooden boards. These devices came in different forms. While the pillory kept people standing, the stocks bound their ankles at ground level. Both were designed to make wrongdoers the center of public shame. A sentence in the pillory or stocks could last anywhere from hours to days, bringing immediate physical discomfort as victims struggled to hold their position. However, the real torment came from the crowd. Locals gathered to jeer, throw rotten food, stones, mud, and even animal waste at the helpless offenders. Many suffered serious injuries, especially to their exposed faces. Some were left scarred, both physically and emotionally. While deaths were rare, they could result from exposure to weather or violent mobs. People were punished for crimes like theft, drunkenness, or blasphemy. But marginalized groups, religious minorities, and political dissidents suffered the most, enduring public humiliation with little mercy. The British Empire's punishments were merciless and unyielding. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.